Do you like taking knitting on holiday with you? Do you like taking knitting with you when you travel? Have you taken knitting with you on travels, either in the country where you live or abroad? I always take knitting with me on holiday, and I have done for probably the last 16 to 17 years. I have flown through quite a few European countries with my knitting. I've knitted in Norway in the winter. I've knitted in Spain in 30+ degree heat. I've knitted in the UK and lots of other countries, cruising around the Mediterranean. I always take my knitting with me. So in today's video, I'm going to share my top tips for traveling with your knitting. A lot of this also applies to crochet. But some of things are knitting specific, specifically traveling with your needles. So we can talk about taking knitting on the plane with you, what to think about when you pack for your holiday or your trip, whether it's a holiday or a business trip, and what kind of projects are most suitable for travel knitting, and especially a few tips about taking your knitting needles and your knitting project on planes, because that's what I get the most questions about. If you're new here, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website YarnAddict.co.uk. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, and please leave me a comment. Tell me if you ever take your knitting on travels with you, if you've travelled abroad with your knitting, if you've gone by plane, have you had any problems? Let me know in the comments, and also let me know what your favourite travel projects are. So I've been taking knitting on holiday with me for quite a few years. I also take knitting with me when I travel in the UK for business, when I travel to teach or to go to knitting shows and things like that. So I'm quite used to thinking about what to take with me when I go traveling. I decided to record this video. I have done similar videos before, but I decided to do this because I'm getting ready to go on holiday in March. I'm going to Norway. In the last 20 years, 22 years I think now, the places I've travelled to the most have been Spain, because my parents owned a flat there for 20 years, which they sold about 18 months ago, and also Norway, because I have a lot of family in Norway. My parents live in Norway, so I go to Norway quite regularly. But I have also travelled through other European countries. I haven't travelled outside of Europe since I got back into knitting. So most of my experiences with travelling abroad with my knitting is based on Europe. I've travelled through various UK airports, Jersey, France, several airports in Spain, Budapest in Hungary, Norway, several airports in Norway, Italy. So a few different countries and airports, and I'm going to share my kind of top tips for taking your knitting on the plane with you, because I'm through airports, because that's probably what I get the most questions about. But we'll also talk about what kind of projects are suitable and what else you need to take with you to make sure that you can knit safely and happily while you're away. So let's talk about what kind of projects you might want to take with you first. Obviously, what kind of projects you can take with you depends on whether you are flying or driving or going by train, bus, whatever. If you are going in the car and you have plenty of luggage space, then you can probably take quite big projects and take as much knitting as you want. So if you think you're going to need 5 projects, 5 sweaters for a 2-week holiday, if you've got the space, you can take that. Also, if you're flying and you're checking in your luggage, you may have more luggage space. I mainly, when I fly, travel with hand luggage only these days. And if I do take a suitcase, it's usually going to Norway at Christmas time, when we need more clothes because it's cold, and Christmas presents and things like that. So space is still short. So my choice of travel knitting is mainly based on the fact that I don't have that much space. So talking about driving to a knitting event, to a yarn show here in the UK, the car is full of yarn and stuff for my store. So my personal stuff has to fit in like a small overnight bag or 2 small overnight bags, and then I normally take like an extra bag for my like knitting and tablet and chargers and makeup and all those extra things. So I can't take a lot with me when I go abroad. But some of the things you want to think about before you leave for your holiday or your trip is, what's the situation like where you're going? Will there be yarn shops where you're going? So I've learned over the years that taking loads of yarn with me to Norway is a bit of a waste of time unless I have something very specific I want to knit while I'm there, because there are loads of yarn shops in Norway. Almost every town in Norway has a yarn shop. And the last 2 times I've been to see my parents in Norway, I've actually bought yarn there. I planned a project before I went, and then I ordered the yarn. I had to ship to my parents so that it was there waiting for me when I arrived. Then I cast on for a new sweater project and knitted on that while I was there. Both those sweater projects have been thinner yarns. They've been like lace weight yarns, so I knew that I would be able to fit the actual projects. I didn't finish it on holiday either time, but I knew I would be able to fit it into my suitcase fairly easily. In fact, I think both times I actually put it in my backpack so that I was working on it on the way back, because they were fairly simple sweaters. If you're buying stuff that's thicker yarn, you've got to remember that's going to take up a lot more space in your suitcase. When we go to Spain, when my parents used to have their flat, there was a yarn shop in the town nearby, but in the summer when we used to go, it wasn't always open, or it had very restricted opening hours. So I've only been there once in the 20 years we used to holiday there. And I've never actually bought much yarn in Spain. I did once in Madrid. I finished the socks I brought with me, and I found 2 yarn shops, and I went and bought some sock yarn to cast on another pair of socks for kind of out and about knitting. But on the whole, when I go to warmer countries, I don't rely on being able to find a yarn shop. If you can do some research before you go, or you know that there are yarn shops nearby, that might help you decide what project to take with you. So I normally take smaller projects on holiday with me, either 4-ply or lace weight projects, because the yarn takes up less space in my suitcase, but also it takes much longer to knit, so you get much better knitting value for money, because it takes you longer to knit up a skein of lace weight yarn than it does a skein of DK yarn, if both yarn skeins are the same skein size. Like 100 grams of lace weight yarn takes you much longer than 100 grams of DK yarn to knit up. I used to quite often take lace shawls with me. So a lace shawl, I would use, say, 1 or 2 skeins of 4-ply, 100 gram skeins of 4-ply yarn or sock yarn, or 100 gram skein of lace weight yarn. Those were the things I would normally take with me on holiday, because they would give me enough knitting to do for a while, but they wouldn't take up too much space in my suitcase, and it would be something that was interesting enough without being too difficult for me, for my knitting skill level, if you like. I also usually take socks with me, or something else that's fairly easy to knit. I can knit them when I'm out and about. When we go to Spain, I usually take a sock and knit on the beach, because it's something that's fairly easy to knit on. It's small, and if I drop it in the sand and it gets covered in sand, I can wash it fairly easily because I normally use superwash sock yarn that I can wash in the washing machine. Also need to think about how challenging you want your knitting to be. Do you want something fairly easy that you don't need to think about, or do you want something more complicated? You also need to make sure that you print out the patterns you need, or put on your tablet, or have you store your patterns. Most of the patterns I take on holiday with me are my own designs, and sometimes I end up designing on the go, and I end up with scribble notes like that, or like that. Actually, that's a list of yarn, that's not a pattern. But I usually end up with scribbled notes. I think that's my sweater that I knitted in Norway last September when I was there, my pink sweater. That's basically the pattern for the yoke of the sweater. So I quite often take a small notebook with me that I can make notes in if I haven't written up the pattern before I go, and even then I quite often will change it. I cast on for a brioche shawl once when we went to Spain, and I cast on at the local airport here in the UK at 3 AM, which was when we arrived at the airport because we had an early flight. And then I changed my mind, redesigned it, ripped it out, cast on again, all while we were kind of having breakfast between 3 and 4 AM, and I hadn't slept all night. not a good idea. So I get some quite undecipherable notes in my notebook. So you might want to bring a notebook so that if there are any problems with the patterns, or you want to make any particular notes about the pattern, if you make any changes, it's always a good idea to write that down. So take a notebook with you, take pencils with you, because they're easier if you rub it out. I always tend to use pen, and then I end up crossing things out, and my handwriting isn't that neat either, so it can end up in a bit of a mess. When we talk about what project to take with you, think about where you're going. Are you going somewhere it's cold? Are you going somewhere it's hot? When we go to Spain, it's usually in the summer and it's usually hot, 30, 35 degrees, 25 to 35 degrees. Costa Blanca in Spain, which is where we've had most of our Spanish holidays, is very, very humid in the summer as well. And we do spend a lot of time on the beach, so I need to make sure that my projects are suitable for that. I don't want a big heavy project. Like the sweater I knitted in Norway last time is alpaca and silk. It's slightly fluffy and it's a sweater. I would not want to be sitting with nearly a full sweater on my lap in Spain, even in the evenings, because it's still quite hot. It's still high 20s and quite humid. Think about where you'll be knitting on holiday. Will you be knitting in your hotel room or apartment? Will you be knitting on a balcony? Will you be taking your knitting out and about to restaurants and bars with you? Will you be knitting on the beach? Will you be knitting in the car, on public transport? Will you be going on a touring holiday and say like a coach trip, and you'll be knitting on the coach while you're driving from place to place? Where are you going to knit? You need to make sure that your projects suit the circumstances in which you'll be knitting. So if you are going on a city break, for example, and most of your knitting will be while traveling on public transport or queuing to get into museums and stuff, or while having a break in a restaurant or a local pub, for example, or coffee shop, then you need to make sure that your project is fairly portable so you don't end up carrying a huge bag just for your knitting. A sweater project, unless it's just like a sleeve or something, probably isn't the best portable project. So small portable projects are things like socks, hats, mittens, gloves, parts of a sweater. So if that's the advantage of knitting sweaters in pieces, is that a sleeve isn't that big. If you're knitting a sweater all in one piece, you get to a point on the second sleeve where you got the whole sweater in your lap. So also think about that. How is the item constructed, and how are you going to manage that while traveling, and how portable do you need your knitting to be? Think about what kind of tools you need to take with you. So I have managed to streamline my knitting tools quite well. So I have one of these, well, I have a few of these mesh cases actually, but I had this one that I use when I travel. This is from Kiko, but I don't think they stock these cases anymore, but it's like an A5 size case, and the stuff that's in here is stuff that's left from my last holiday. So it's the yarn I knitted my husband's hat in. I always take a barber cord with me, 1 or 2 barber cords, some pens. This is something I bought in Norway last time to measure my tension. I don't necessarily need that in here. Row counter. If I think I'm going to want to add beads, I always put a crochet hook in. Sometimes, whatever project I choose, if I'm not planning to add beads, sometimes I will still choose a bag of beads in a suitable colour and a crochet hook and put that in the bag just in case. And I also quite often take some post-it notes with me, so if I need to make any notes, I can do that quite easily. And then I also usually take a notebook with me. It's preferably a small notebook. And then I have a case like this. It's just a relatively small tin, and in here I have a pair of small scissors. These are really, really tiny, like that. And some waste yarn for afterthought heel and socks. I have stitch markers, sewing needle, tape measure, all kind of my essentials that I need. The only thing that doesn't fit in here is my row counter, and if I took my tape measure out, my row counter would fit in there, but I like to have the tape measure in there. I also have a row counter app on my phone, which also syncs to my watch. I don't know, I think, there we go. Don't know if you can see that. There we go. Don't know how easy it is to see that. So if I need a row counter app when I'm out and about, I can use my watch if I want to. And I also have that same app on my phone as well. Also think about what knitting needles to take with you, especially if you're going by plane. First time I took knitting needles on the plane with me was coming back from Spain. I hadn't taken knitting to Spain with me because I thought it'd be too hot. Then I bought some very cheap acrylic yarn and knitting needles while I was there and cast them for a project. And then when our holiday came to an end, I wanted to take that back to the UK with me. So I asked, when we checked in Alicante, I asked if I could take the knitting needles on the plane with me. I had circular bamboo needles. They asked to see the needles. They saw that they were wooden ones and circular ones. And I said, yeah, that's fine. To be honest, it's not really the airline that decides whether you get to take the knitting with you. It's really the people in security. So even though the check-in staff had told me it was okay, if I got to security and the security officer said, no, sorry, you can't take that, then I would have to have left it behind. It's not really the airline's decision. I know people who rung the airline before they travel to ask if they can take knitting needles with them on the plane and have been told either yes or no. One person I know was told no. I've flown with the same airline several times and always knitted, so that's not a problem. I've also flown through the same airport that she was flying from here in the southwest of England and never had a problem. So here are my tips to getting your knitting through security, especially your knitting needles. Now here in the UK, and obviously this varies from country to country, but on the government website there is a list of what's permitted in your hold luggage and what's permitted in your hand luggage, and knitting needles is permitted in both your checked luggage and your hand luggage, and I will put the link to that page below this video. I know people who kind of save that page on their phone so they can like show it. I would not get into an argument with the security officer. If I was challenged about my knitting needles, I would say, well, according to this website it says it's allowed, but if they start arguing about it, I would just hand them over, because I wouldn't want to risk being told I can't fly, because that would not be fun. So I would never announce to them or tell them that I've got knitting needles. I wouldn't turn up at security and say, I've got knitting needles, is that okay? I just leave them in my bag. I take out everything else I need to take out for security. So my liquids bag, all my technology, my phones, all that kind of stuff. Take out everything I know I need to take out. And I try and make sure that I don't accidentally leave anything in my bag that shouldn't be there. So if I have a water bottle, I make sure it's empty, because I travel with my reusable water bottle, which you can do as long as it's empty. But I take it out and I put that in the tray as security as well. So if they need to check it's empty, they can. I try and make sure that all my liquids and creams and whatever is in my liquids bag. I try and make sure that I've taken out all my technology. I try and basically reduce the risk of them having to search me. There is one airport here in the UK, Bristol, where I frequently get searched. It's probably the airport I've been searched the most. And I've never had a problem with my knitting needle. I've been searched at other airports as well, in Norway, in Spain, in Scotland, in England, and I've never had a problem with my knitting needles. I have heard of people who have had problems with knitting needles. I think most of the people I've heard who've had problems in Europe have been Greek airports. Pretty sure there may be other ones as well, but most of the time when I hear of people having problems, it seems to be Greek airports. So what I do when it comes to going through security is I used to always travel with wooden needles because I thought they were safer than metal ones. I don't actually use wooden needles that much anymore, although I have recently bought some Lantern Moon ones and I quite like those. So maybe I will take those on my next trip. I don't know. But what I usually do is I will take my interchangeable needles. I will screw the tips off and the cables and put them in my mesh case, or if I have a bit more space, I might take a small pencil case and put my needle tips in there with some pens. There's usually a few pens in here. Usually there's like 3 or 4 pens in here, and then I put my needle tips in there and my cables in there, and then that goes in my hand luggage. If I'm not taking a case or anything like this, then I sometimes will put my needle tips in, if I have a pocket in my bag where I have a few pens, I will sometimes put them in there. Basically, if you put your needle tips with pens, they may just think they're pens. So I think that reduces the risk of them wanting to check your luggage. But I usually also have a project that's on the needles that I can knit on at the airport. Sometimes I knit on it on the way to the airport, at the airport, on the plane, whatever. So I tend to leave that project on the needles, but I try and remember to take interchangeable needles. And I usually also take spare needle tips in the size I need, especially if I'm going to Spain, where I'm not sure if I can get Chagu interchangeable needle tips, which is the needles I use most of the time. If I go to Norway, then I know that I will be able to get those needle tips, because a lot of Norwegian yarn shops seem to stock Chagu now. Another tip is Nipro, which is known as Knitter's Pride in the US, and Lantern Moon, and Lykke, which a lot of people are pronouncing likey or like. It's pronounced Lykke, it's a Norwegian word. Those three needle brands, their tips and cables are interchangeable. So I can use my Lantern Moon cable with my Lykke needle tips. The Nipro and Lantern Moon needles and cables can be used interchangeably with each other, and they also fit the Lykke needles. So I may take my Lykke tips and my Lantern Moon needles, or my Lantern Moon needle tips and my Nipro cables. So you can interchange those. So if you have Lykke needles and you want to take those, but you may not be sure if there you're going to is stocking Lykke, because they're less popular, I would say. Lykke shouldn't be a problem on the plane because they are wooden ones. But if, for example, I went to Norway, I've never seen Lykke needles sold in Norway. So if I arrive in Norway and I've had my Lykke needles confiscated, or I've broken them, because I have broken Lykke needle tips sometimes, which is why I prefer to travel with metal, because I have broken wooden ones before on holiday. I know that I can go into a yarn shop in Norway and buy Nipro needle tips. And a lot of countries in Europe, a lot of yarn shops stock Nipro. They're probably the most popular needle brand these days. So take interchangeable needles, take your needle tips off, put them with some pens, and hope for the best. Circular needles are also good for knitting in the public. If you have a lack of space, like you're sitting on the plane, there is people sitting next to you, especially if you're in the middle seat. I always book an aisle seat because then I can lean across into the aisle a bit and have a little bit more space. I'm also aware of the fact that I am quite a big person, so I always feel a bit sorry for the person stuck next to me, but I always book an aisle seat, because then I do have the choice of leaning across into the aisle a little bit if it's a bit of lacking space, and also means I can stretch my legs out into the aisle if I need to, because I have quite long legs and I have problems in my knees as well. Apparently, I read that the window seat gives you more space as well, because the side of the aircraft tend to curve out a bit, whereas the middle seat gives you the least space, which is why I always book an aisle seat. So if you have a bit of lack of space when you're knitting, you don't want to be knitting with straight needles and be like elbowing your seat partner all the time, whether it is a family member or a friend or a complete stranger. Circular needles, things are held more in the middle. It's kind of in your lap. You move your elbows less. It's just a more pleasant knitting experience, I think, and I think a more sociable knitting experience. You're less likely to cause problems with the person sitting next to you because they take up less space. They also take up a lot less space in your luggage. You can use a relatively small project bag. You don't have to have a project bag that's long enough to fit your needles in there. So you can use a smaller project bag to fit your needles, your project into. If you are traveling with checked luggage as well, put some spare needle tips in your checked luggage. When we used to travel with checked luggage, I always did that. I would take the needles I would need for my travel project in my hand luggage, and maybe a spare pair of needle tips in case mine got confiscated. And then I would put spare needles in my hold luggage. But these days, we rarely travel with hold luggage. I did a couple of times in 2020 because I had to go to Norway for a longer period of time, like 4 weeks. And first time I went, I didn't know how long I was going to be there for because I didn't have a return ticket. And the second time, I was supposed to be there for 4 weeks, but there was a lot of plane cancellations, and I ended up being there for 5 weeks. So I travelled with hold luggage then, but normally I only travel with hand luggage these days. But if I am traveling with hold luggage, I will put some spare needles in the hold luggage. Whatever you do, be polite. Don't argue with the security officers if they say you can't take your knitting needles. If you're traveling from a UK airport, you can try and say, well, I looked on the government website and it says it's allowed, but say politely. And they might say, oh, okay, or show me or whatever. Or they might say, well, sorry, you're not taking your knitting needles. There's no need to argue with security. They have the power to deny you flying. I've seen that happen at Norwegian airport over a bottle of baby milk. This mum with a baby, I think she was travelling on her own, she got quite irate and upset and argued with them over this bottle of baby milk, and they were threatening her with not being able to fly. To me, that seems a bit harsh over baby milk. Travelling with a baby is really stressful. I've done it myself. And so I thought they were a bit harsh on her, but they have the power and you don't. So be polite and don't argue with them. If they take your knitting needles, so be it. I've heard people who've had their knitting needles, like the needle tips, cut off the cables, which seems very harsh. That's why put them on interchangeable cables, and then at least you can screw them off. You might say, well, look, these screw off, and then can I put them in my handbag? And they might say yes. Or if they insist on confiscating them, let them take them, and just don't take your most expensive needles on holiday with you. Also, if they notice one of your projects for knitting needles, but they haven't seen the rest of your needles that are hidden away in your hand luggage, don't tell them you got more needles. Just smile politely and look sad and keep going. I've never had a problem knitting on the plane. I have been told a few times quite a few years ago that I wasn't allowed to knit during takeoff and landing. My experience is that if the cabin crew care about your knitting at all, it's usually that they're interested in what you're doing. And when they go past, they'll say, oh, have you finished yet? How are you getting on? That kind of thing. So I've never had a problem. I've never had the person sit next to me complain about me knitting. I don't always knit on the plane. I mainly knit in the airport. Most of our plane journeys are from the UK to Norway or the UK to Spain. They're about 2 hours. It's not a lot of time, and if I can sleep on the plane, I will quite often try and sleep because it makes the time go quicker. So I do more knitting on the way to the airport and in the airport lounge than I do on the plane. I've never had a complaint from the person sitting next to me about the fact that I'm knitting. A friend of mine took her knitting a holiday once to a Greek island, I think it was, and they were sitting at a bus stop and she was knitting ready for the bus, and then when the bus arrived, she got on the bus and left her knitting behind. So be very careful if you take your knitting with you. If you put it down, put it into your bag so that it's with you. And I always, when I leave anywhere, I always try and look around me. So if I leave the plane, a bus, a train, a restaurant, a coffee shop, wherever, a park bench, I will usually just look around me to make sure I picked up everything. Then it may be an idea, if your project is very precious and you're worried about losing it, to put your name and maybe your phone number in there so that people can contact you. Depending on where you are, if you're still on your holiday location, you might be able to meet up with them and they might give you your project back. If you've already traveled to the UK, asking them to post it to you might be a bit much, because unless you can reimburse them of the cost somehow. But at least you may get your project back. But I have heard of people who've lost their project on holidays, and that would be very upsetting. But it can happen. That can happen in your home country as well if you're not careful enough. Also think about how much knitting you really need to bring with you on holiday. If you're going for 2 weeks and you're going to be fairly busy, it's a fairly active holiday, do you really need a sweater, 2 shawls, 3 pairs of socks and a hat? Or will one small portable project and one slightly bigger project be enough? I frequently take too much knitting on holiday with me, and I'm trying to get better at that now, because most places I'll be able to buy yarn if I run out. Last time we went to Spain, we went to Alicante and actually found a yarn shop in Alicante. Somebody told me years ago there was one there, and when I think back now to where they explained where it was, it's exactly where they said it was. but I misunderstood the instructions and thought it was somewhere else. But I found it last time we were there last year, so if we go to Alicante again, I will take less knitting with me because I know I can get to the yarn shop and buy more if I need to. When I go to Norway now, I try and be very careful about how much knitting I take with me, and on several occasions I've actually bought yarn in Norway or ordered it and had it shipped to my parents' house before I get there, so that I can have the pleasure of buying yarn on holiday but not worry about having too much stuff to take back with me. So when I went to Norway, I took a small project for the travel over, and then I had yarn shipped to my parents' house. I think I've done that 3 times now. Make sure you leave enough space in your suitcase to buy some souvenir yarn. If you are able to find a yarn shop, then you might want to bring some yarn back with you, especially if you go to countries where knitting is popular, like Norway. I know people who've been to Norway on holiday and they've come back with half a suitcase full of yarn. So make sure you can keep enough space in your suitcase, especially if you're flying with hand luggage only and you don't want to pay for extra luggage. Some local airlines especially are very, very strict with how much hand luggage they allow on. So do make sure you got space and enough weight, free weight, to be able to take some souvenir yarn home with you. If you are yarn shopping abroad and you don't really want to buy yarn because you haven't got space in your suitcase, other things that are a good idea to buy, other ways you can support local yarn shops and buy something without buying bulky yarn, is notions. So stitch markers, scissors, different kind of knitting notions, tools, smaller things that don't take up a lot of space and don't weigh very much, but feel like you've treated yourself to something in the country you're in. One of the yarn shops near where my parents live, there are 2 yarn shops in my parents' town. There used to always be 1, but there are now 2. One of them, they stock loads of really nice stitch markers, little tins that I use for beads, lots of little tools and fun stuff. So I will quite often buy some of that instead of buying yarn. So be realistic about how much knitting you're actually going to get done on holiday. Think about what kind of knitting you want to do. What's the temperature like? What are you going to be doing? Where are you going to be staying? Where are you going to be doing most of your knitting? And then make an informed, realistic decision about how much knitting you will actually get done and how much knitting you need to take with you. Make sure you only take the tools and notions that you actually need. Do you need to have a big A4 knitting case full of needles and tools and notions? If you're going on holiday for 2 weeks, you probably don't need to take all your knitting tools and notions with you and all your needles. Work out what you need and put them into a smaller bag or a smaller tin to make it easier to fit in your suitcase. Think about, if you're flying, how you're going to get your needles through security without alerting them. Try and make sure there's nothing else in your suitcase that makes them want to search your luggage, and take some spare needles and hide them away somewhere. Maybe put your needles in 2 or 3 different places, so if they find one lot of needles, they don't find the other. I was stopped at a local airport a couple of years ago, and I had 2 pairs of scissors, one of my like little knitting scissors, and a pair of nail scissors. Now the knitting scissors were the same size as the nail scissors. But when I went through security, I was asked, he said, have you got scissors in here? And I said, yes, just a little tiny pair of like nail scissors. And he said, well, can I see them? And I said, well, where in the suitcase? I said, do you know where they are? Because I didn't want to empty out my whole suitcase. He said, yeah, it's along this side here, this edge. So I opened my suitcase, I pulled out my toiletry case, it was my nail scissors. I showed them to him, he said, yeah, they're fine. Scissors in the UK are illegal to take on planes if they are less than 6 centimeters long, or the blades are less than 6 centimeters long. And I had another pair of scissors in that suitcase as well, in my notions bag, but he obviously hadn't seen those, or they hadn't triggered anything. So that's why I asked, which, do you know where they are? Because I knew I had 2 pairs, but I didn't want to find the other pair if I didn't have to, because they were more at the bottom of my suitcase, so that would have meant moving more stuff. And normally my suitcases are so stuffed that if I take something out, I struggle to get back in again, which is why I really, really don't want to be searched in security. Look into what's available at your location. Can you buy yarn there? Can you buy notions? Can you buy knitting needles? Do a bit of research online before you go and see if you can find somewhere to buy knitting tools and yarn if you need to. Let me know your experience of knitting on holiday, especially going by plane. Have you taken knitting needles on planes before? What do you like to knit? What do you like to knit for car holidays, driving holidays? What do you like to knit if you go by public transport? What do you like to knit if you're going by plane? What do you like to knit if you're going to a hot country, cool country? Tell me in the comments. And have you ever had your knitting needles confiscated at airport security? And if you have, which airport in which country, please? We need to know this information so we can share it with everybody else and be warned. Okay, I hope this was useful. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. I post videos twice a week here on YouTube, and I do a combination of knitting reviews, tutorials, chatty videos like this with knitting tips, podcast episodes, yarn and product reviews, talking about my designs. So a variety of things. If you're new here, I would really appreciate it if you stuck around and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.